Scott Adams has turned the world somewhat upside down with, at first, his acknowledgement that those of us who had resisted this so-called vaccine campaign had actually turned out to be right, and that he had in fact been wrong, and that seemed like a generous, forthright, proper admission of having changed his position. He then followed it up with a slew of it's like 60,000 tweets at this point that are confusing and seem to muddy the waters. And the gist of at least many of these follow-on tweets is that although he acknowledges that he got it wrong and that those of us who resisted...
Some other people didn't get it wrong. His point is it was a coin flip. So you could either go with the official narrative or you could resist the official narrative, and some people resisted and they turned out to be right. But there was no method to figuring out what the truth was because the information stream is so polluted.
One interpretation of which is, I didn't have a method, therefore no method can exist.
Yes, and, I must say, Scott is an interesting character, and I like a good deal of what he does. The way he prods people is, I think, quite useful often. And there is an aspect to this prodding that I think is positive, but there's also a weird feature of it where it seems to be that he is resistant to the idea that there might even be a method. And his basic point is, well, then teach it to me, right? Mm-hmm. And the answer is there is a method. It's not teachable that way.
Right.
And go ahead.
Well, I guess, and as I said in the one response that I gave to him online, it can't be a static strategy, right? Like you can't, the teach it to me seems to be, if it's in good faith at all, which of course many people are convinced it's not, but seems to imagine just tell me the thing and then I'll do that thing next time. Tell me the people and I'll just do what they did next time. And this is not the way complex systems works. And frankly, the thing I said to you was, I really would have expected that the genius mind behind Dilbert would understand that, because the recognition of the gaming of office politics at every level would seem to be easily generalizable to static strategies and people who come at you with patently easily falsifiable claims aren't the things that you should be relying on. Right, like that would seem to have been something I would have imagined that would be something that would be in Scott Adams' head, given Dilbert.
It would be native to him, yeah. Okay, so I will say I was gratified to see the number of people who said, "What about Brett and Heather? What about DarkHorse?" Right, because frankly, people who are longtime listeners have seen something that is not an easily described method, but it's clearly methodological in its own way. Yeah. And they've also watched it be vindicated on issue after issue. So there is a question about, if you take Scott's claim that this is coin flipping, it is not impossible that you could flip 8 or 10 heads in a row, but it is exceedingly unlikely. And I would also point out...
We're going to have Tom Stoppard play.
Right. The Tom Stoppard
Rosencrantz
and Guildenstern segment is quite the right model, because basically the playwright takes the liberty of writing an improbably long string of coin flips, which is then what the actors deliver. And the actors are therefore in a position to detect that they are in a play or something is off because it's so unlikely, but because it's no less likely than any other sequence. Anyway, there's lots of philosophical drilling down on that question to be done. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. Scott, you have delivered a hypothesis. It is a perfectly valid hypothesis that everybody who got it right is guessing, that they are simply choosing between binary alternatives, and some people will be improbably lucky. However, Scott, that hypothesis makes a clear prediction, okay? if you take somebody who has had an improbably long sequence of correct guesses in your coin flip universe, they will, going forward, have no more success at being accurate than anyone else, because there's nothing about having been right that predisposes you to be right in that coin flip
Ipso
universe.
facto. If random, then random.
Then random. If random, then random. Like it. That's exactly what it is. So, Scott, you've signed yourself up for that. Now, the issue then is, if we are claiming that there is something that is not exactly a method, it is not something that we can, let's take an example of what it means that it's not exactly a method, all right? If you saw an amazing feat of archery, and there are indeed some favorites of mine, I'm now forgetting the name of the fella who...
Me too.
But anyway, there's some people who demonstrate some incredible archery skill, and, some of it could be faked a little bit, like, throwing a bottle top, not a bottle top, a can flip top piece into the air and shooting an arrow through it. You could shoot 1,000,000 arrows and then film the one that did it. But if the guy throws one up in the air, shoots it, throws another one up in the air and shoots it, that you can't.
Without an edit.
Right. And so the point is, how many 100 million shots would you have to do in order to get lucky twice in a row like that? And there's actually a great channel, I forget what it is, but there's a channel of trick shots where, somebody will set up a shot glasses sitting on a turntable, and they're bouncing pennies off of something, and it will go in, and it's done. They obviously are using the method of shooting 1,000,000 times, so not 1,000,000, but that's an exaggeration. But they're shooting a huge number of times, and they film the ones that work, and then they cheer because they're bored out of their minds trying to get these things to happen.
And that's finally, archery as well?
No, it's not archery. It's 1,000,000 different trick shots. It's pretty cool stuff. But anyway, the point here is, if I say, oh, this person that does these amazing archery trick shots has a method, right? And you say, method? What is that method?
Yeah, show me.
Right. Well,
let me in on the method.
Right. Let me in on the method so I can do those things. Well, no, it's not that kind of a method. Is there a method running inside the head of a fantastic archer who can do amazing things? Of course, right? Or somebody who does trick shots in pool, whatever it might be. But the point is, that method is not an explicit method necessarily, and B, it is not simple. It's a hard thing to learn.
Well, and it's also it feels very precarious if you're accustomed to the landscape in which certainty is necessary. It feels very precarious at first to learn. And, we had this experience in our classrooms quarter after quarter, year after year, and, and in grad school before that. But, welcoming students into a classroom saying, we're going to learn how to think evolutionarily here. And very often we're not going to know. And we're gonna sit there in the not knowing. And yes, that sounds philosophical and vaguely Buddhist or something, but it is there. There's a reason that many traditions converge on this. Actually, the uncertainty and the spending the time trying to figure out what the question is, and not having come to a conclusion so that you can be open to the various sources of information that are coming at you is part of what is necessary. And you can't just hear that and say, oh, okay, I'll do that then. Because you can try, and you should try, and you will get better at it over time, but you won't be as good at it the first time you do that as you are the 100th time. You just won't be.
Yep. So I thought what we should do is we should actually describe a few things that have gone into what you and I are doing that you could describe as methodological, and we could move on from there. But okay. I think the first thing for somebody like Scott, who I assume is genuinely curious about how you would improve your chances in a garbage information landscape, right? And a couple of things that are relevant are, one, recognizing that the garbagey nature of the information is in some sense reliable because there are processes that have turned our truth-seeking mechanisms into paradoxes, right? So basically the answer is a stuck field is easy to beat, right? A field that becomes overly concerned about profitability or about reaching a conclusion that is politically viable and understood to be morally good, those fields are going to be hobbled in their own truth-seeking. And so the point is, you're not beating, right, a world full of experts who are doing their best and screwing it up. You're dealing with a world full of experts who are compromised by, careerism, for example. Careerism exists. As Heather points out, you're the Dilbert guy, right? Imagine that what goes on in offices goes on with fancier jargon and bigger, better equipment in laboratories, in universities, right? That's what's going on. You've got careerism, credentialism, territoriality, all of these things compromise these fields. And if you don't have obligations to those structures, you are actually free to do something that they can't do. So one thing...
I'm just going to repeat that point, which is that many people outside of science, even if they can see the inanity, which sometimes verges into insanity in their particular domain, be it office culture or entertainment or the law or government or whatever it is, somehow assume that what happens in science, often now people don't assume that what happens in academia is pure, because I don't even know what, like something's been torn off. Like we can all see this now, right?
Yeah.
But people still imagine that, well, if you call it science, the people who went into science must have done so for only the purest of reasons. There must only be the most honorable and upstanding moral players in science. And therefore, if it comes at you under the imprimatur of science, it must be science-y. And, honestly, the last 3 years have been the, repeated, constant proof that that's not the case. But from within science, since the early 90s, early mid-90s, when we started in grad school, and even in undergrad, when we were working with some of the best scientists in the world, it was clear that science is no different, right? That there are brilliant players and there are ridiculous players, and there are naive ones and non-naive ones, and the entire gamut of human experience is represented there as well, as of course it would be. And of course you would, if you are in the world and you see, what has replaced, frankly, religion as the thing that everyone looks up to and doesn't question? Oh, it's science. Well, all I have to do is get myself some glassware and a lab coat, and maybe I'll have to get that fancy degree, but then I am unquestionable. And so, we've been doing this for decades, but in part what we've been doing is saying to, we've got lots of scientists in our audience, but for the people who don't think of themselves as scientists, saying not only can you, but you must, question the stuff when it comes at you, when it's dressed up as science, because of course that's going to be a thing that they do when they're not actually revealing science to you.
Yeah, or another way to say it is questioning the science is how you do science, right?
Yes.
That is the thing, right?
Much tighter.
It's much tighter. But yes. So anyway, at one level, you've got a system that, if even from the outside, you can see it's riddled with perverse incentives, right? You can see that the way funding is done is going to result in people who play the game outcompeting people who do the job exquisitely well but don't play the game, right? That's true, and it's true at a level you probably can't imagine if you've not been inside of a university setting. But all right, so you've got a bunch of fields that are underperforming is a severe understatement. You've got a bunch of fields that have gotten themselves stuck in a ditch for no reason. And the question is, what can you do outside of those fields? Now, you and I, first of all, there are just a bunch of things that belong on the table here. One of them is, how did we get it right? Well, we didn't get it right. That's not what happened. What happened was, we started with our best understanding of what was taking place, which was clearly wrong in some ways, and we moved in the direction of getting righter and righter, right? That's the way it's actually done. It's not a method for being right. There is no method for being right. There's a method for taking your understanding and upgrading it based on information. And I will say, one of the most important features of this environment is figuring out how not to process everything. If you feel responsible for processing every fact relevant to a question that you are interested in, you will end up processing some facts that aren't facts, that are simply untrue. And if your point is, what we do in science is we reconcile all of the facts so that they fit together in a model, but a third of your facts aren't facts at all, they're the result of corruption or error or something like that, then your model will not work. It will,
And it's anti-scientific to say, well, but it's a fact, therefore it must work. Like, okay, you have to keep going back down the decision tree, the assumption tree, and saying, which of the things that I know to be true aren't in fact true? That is how you reconcile irreconcilable facts.
Yep.
You figure out which of them isn't in fact a fact.
Which of them isn't in fact a fact. And there are I don't want to say tricks, but there are ways to spot them, right? So for example, if your model is getting better and better, how would you know it's getting better and better? Because it gets more and more predictive, and then it stops doing that. Well, that suggests that you picked up something that you thought was a fact that wasn't, right? And so the ability to back your model off and say, when did it stop improving and what happened at that place? And then looking at the thing that you picked up and you say, why did I think that that was one of the ones I could rely on? So anyway, it's things like this.
And what was the source of that? And do I have any other facts from that source? And how reliable are they? And so, it's many tentacled in terms of like how you assess both, starting with as few assumptions as possible, being absolutely sure of them at sort of like the axiomatic level, and adding facts sometimes liberally, but if you do, being aware that some of them may turn out to be something that you have to reverse, and trying not to build too much on the things that you haven't fully vetted.
Right.
And we don't, this last 3 years, we didn't, no one knew for, in many moments, like, what landscape are we even in? What are we actually even trying to figure out?
Yeah.
Right. And the early days, as we talked about here on DarkHorse, almost 3 years ago, oh my God, it's the Wild West in a good way out there with regard to scientific publishing. All of those preprint servers that were just churning out papers without the peers, the peer review process, which is supposed to be this great thing, it's actually become a scourge on science. Without the peer review process getting in the way and the delays associated with it, suddenly there was all of this often really high quality science available.
Right. But the other thing about it was, because it was happening so quickly that we were all driven to the preprint servers rather than the so-called peer-reviewed literature, what that meant was you didn't need to explain to anybody why you were processing this paper and not that one. The expectation is not that you were going to process the entire, group of unpublished results. Some of them are garbage and won't make it, right?
And they were coming out, just so fast.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the point is, look, this is the problem. It is the selectivity, right, where you decide, hey, that result actually would make a lot of sense. I think that one might be valid. Now I'm going to go look at the method and see whether it actually says what I think it says. And if it does say what I think it says, here are the cascading consequences of it logically. And then, if it turns out that result is bad, you have to have kept track of what you stacked on it so that you remember to reverse those things.
And there's something critical and slightly obscure in what you just said with regard to the selectivity, that it is often considered a given that in literature review, in assessing, what is known in a field before perhaps you embark on testing a hypothesis of your own, that you do a thorough literature review, right? You're supposed to know everything that anyone has ever thought, at least if they've thought it and published it on a topic. And for some topics, and under more slow-moving times, that is in many ways an honorable approach. Although we used to in our classrooms argue that it might be better to go in, especially if you're an undergraduate doing a research project, go in without knowing what other people have thought, and then afterwards, after you have figured out, after you have designed your experiment and taken the data and analyzed it, and now know what you think know what you think you found, then go and see what other people have thought. That actually helps you hone your own understanding of the universe better. But that aside, one thing that is being gamed now is this idea that you aren't really allowed to speak on a topic until you know everything there is to say about it. So this is how we get siloed. This is how specialists become the only people who are allowed to speak on a particular topic. But what do you do when, is it public health? Is it virology? Is it vaccinology? Is it immunology? Is it, in fact, evolutionary biology, which, of course, is at the interface between all of those? Because evolutionary biology has a lot of specific parts to it. There are phylogenetic systematists, for instance, and within that there are cladists and there are maximum likelihoodists. Evolutionary biology writ large is the interface of all of these evolved, complex systems coming together, and frankly, it gives you the bigger view down than if you are just narrowly going like, well, if it's not about viruses, I don't know anything about it, right? So that is part of what it is to be thinking evolutionarily, is to have the broader view.
Yeah, that was one of the things on my list of primary contributors, is that, almost everybody in almost every discipline is over-specialized, because competition, which is the thing that is being used to drive this forward, competition, which is unfortunately not so much about being right anymore, it's about publication and other proxies for being right, which turn out to be pretty bad. But that competition has created an environment in which people become the experts on something so narrow that it doesn't apply to anything else. And that is a recipe for becoming a fool with an advanced degree. So evolutionary biology, as you said, is the generalist paradigm that allows you, without being a specialist, to understand how vaccinology and immunology integrate, and how epidemiology and vaccinology and epidemiology integrate, for example. So in any case, you and I have a toolkit, right? It's not specialist in any of these domains, but it is capable of dealing with all of them. That was one of the things that we heavily leveraged. The other thing is central to what we said in our book about how you navigate novel problems, right? What we say in the book about novel problems is we use the moniker campfire. Campfire is how human beings bootstrap solutions to problems they don't already have. And they do it by talking to each other. The idea is the campfire happens in the evening when you're not busy looking for roots and tubers or huntable animals.
Navigating phone trees.
Navigating.
I'd rather be hunting for roots and tubers, but
that raises for me the image of hunter-gatherers in the Serengeti and the occasional phone tree from where they presumably get their phones. But
anyway,
we have digressed.
Sorry.
But anyway, the point is, evolution is a generalist toolkit. It allows you to process these things. Campfire is the process of more than one individual pooling what they know, pooling their different skill sets. Individuals don't tend to have the identical skill set. You and I are both evolutionary biologists, but we take very different approaches to it. But the point is,
and coming at each other and saying, "Oh, well, I think this." Like, I don't get it. What do you think?
Right.
I think this. Oh, you think that? No, you still don't have it. Oh, I think this. Oh, I see what you think now. Here's why I think you're wrong. And
right.
Doing that with love, if you have it, or at least some affection and recognition that the person that you're talking to is another human being, as opposed to the way that argument and conversation, in quotes, tends to happen on social media and in sort of cartoonish fashion these days, which is, well, if you disagree, you must be evil. Or if you disagree, you must not be human.
Right.
No. What we're doing by disagreeing, like that's the love. Like that is the sign that you actually care about the other person, as opposed to saying, "Oh, it's too much work. I'm not gonna do it." Like that's actually giving up, and that's a sign of disrespect.
Absolutely. And I'll say two more things before we move down the road here a piece. One is the ability to filter out stuff you don't want to process is essential, or don't think that you should process because you have doubts about it, even though it will result in you throwing out things that are true, right? The point is you want to bias in that direction. Including garbage in your model is much worse than failing to include something true or being delayed and waiting to include it, right?
Yes.
So a preference more or less for type 2 error over type 1. But the problem is an actor who is perversely incentivized and liberated to pick and choose what they process will, of course, engage in confirmation bias. Somebody who has written a book on a premise that is incorrect, right? That person is much harder to back off that premise because they now have a lot riding on it. It will be embarrassing, and it's hard to unpublish a book. So,
or, even more so, built a career on.
Same.
Right? The late stage late career stage academics who have built everything on something very rarely say, you know what, not so much.
Right.
There are a couple of famous examples, which I'm forgetting at the moment, but it is stunning when you see these sort of late career reversals, in which the person says, well, okay, glad I know, and that maybe that too. Like I've been in other contexts recently, I've been reminded of this "I'm glad I know" revelation. Like, well, that sucked. Now I saw how many people weren't courageous, or weren't telling the truth, or that the thing that I believed and built all this other stuff on was wrong. Well, glad I know. Okay, sunk cost is sunk cost, and let's move forward now.
Yep. Yeah. And I will point out, you and I have a book out that is not yet available in softcover, right? That's a pretty new book. We have acknowledged a couple things in it that we believe to be accurate when we wrote it, that we have come to a different understanding in even that short period of time. So the point is that commitment to what's actually true. So I'm thinking specifically of what we said about supplementation. And
yes, well, although I will, so let's just, since you brought it up, right? I stand by the idea that we should prefer to get our nutrients from our diet, or in the case of vitamin D, from the sun.
Me too.
But especially with regard to vitamin D, which is the one that we called out by name in the book, the number of people living in high latitudes, mostly inside, mostly covered in clothes when they're outside, and actually live at a latitude above which, for some of the year, they literally cannot synthesize vitamin D from the sun. Vitamin D supplementation seems to be, quite the opposite of what we argued in the book, like an actual, a true good that actually enhances immune function and is contributing to people's health.
Right. Now, I will say that this is, again, a place where the model keeps getting more refined, right? There are caveats about this. There are apparently multiple kinds of vitamin D, and so depending upon what you measure, you'll see different patterns. But my current model, which I think you and I share, is sunlight is by far the best way to generate or to acquire vitamin D through this photosynthetic process. And that supplementation, while it is important, is much less effective. It is much better for driving up levels in the blood to prevent vitamin D from being lost, right? So the deficiency.
I think that was confusing the way you said it. I think it's better. Supplementation is better for maintaining levels as opposed to for driving up levels.
That's what I mean. So the basic point is make vitamin D while the sun shines, as we said. And that means not just, hey, I'm out in the sun, I'm making vitamin D. Well, you're making vitamin D on your face and maybe your arms, but you're probably wearing long pants or whatever. So make as much vitamin D.
We're encouraging you to get naked.
As close to it as you can while your app or whatever you're using tells you the sun is high enough in the sky during the right part of the year that you can actually make vitamin D. And
on
then
the right part of the planet.
On the right, you've got, these things have to align. The fact that the sun is shining isn't enough. But make as much vitamin D as you can so that you're not deficient, and then dramatically slow the rate at which you lose vitamin D and become deficient with supplementation, something like that. So anyway, this is that model, I'm not telling you that's the final state. I'm telling you that having refined the model 3 or 4 times, that's the current state. So, all right.
That was you raised that as, even our book, which just came out a year and a half ago, has some things in it that our positions have evolved.
Right. Vitamin D being one, and I would say we said something absolutely unequivocal in the book about vaccines and the miraculous contribution they have made to human health, which I still believe, but I would certainly put a caveat in there now and say there are different vaccine technologies, and that the value of this technique has to now be investigated with respect to, is there a level of vaccination against too many pathogens simultaneously that causes it not to be good? Is there a protocol that should be deployed in which you are told that you should avoid certain antigens within a certain period of time after you've been vaccinated? Are adjuvants just simply a dead end to begin with?
Okay, but it's not a book about vaccines.
Right.
It's mostly not a book about health and medicine.
Right.
Although there's a chapter in there, 2 chapters on health and medicine. And what we say specifically is the 3 great successes of Western medicine are surgery, antibiotics, and vaccines. And we also say all of them can be used in times and contexts when they should not be used. We did not go into. I think we tell one story about the Cipro, whatever that class of antibiotics is that's got a long floxamine something, that probably contributed to my rupturing my Achilles tendon many years after we'd both been on Cipro a lot. So we do tell one specific antibiotic story, but it's not a book that explores all of the places where things are gotten right and things have gotten wrong. And unlike vitamin D, the information was out there and available, and we didn't have it. Whereas largely what has happened since the book went out of our hands and we had no more ability to change it, has been most of the reveal of what, like an update based on things that have happened since publication is different than an update based on actually we kind of got this wrong and we had the ability to know better. And I think this is two different situations.
I agree. I think we're deep in the weeds, but the basic point was things like having built a career, having written a book, make it hard to update a model because you have now a risk of embarrassment, and a commitment to updating these models is essential. In fact, you probably shouldn't write the book if you can't update the model later, if the book turns out to be in some way imprecise or inaccurate. Mm-hmm. All right, so generalist toolkit. Active discussion between people who don't feel the obligation to validate what the other person is saying, but understand that proper science is done when you push each other around, and that's not personal, mm-hmm. right? That's how we were both trained. That's how the cultures of the laboratories in which we learned to think evolutionarily, that's how it went. And that's how you learn the method. It's not the kind of thing, Scott, that you can see on a piece of paper and know it and not be wrong again. That's not going to work. You can't do anything to guarantee that you'll never be wrong again unless you never make any claims again. Right. So, all right. Scientific method, generalist toolkit, campfire discussions, and don't expect to be right. Expect to get more right over time based on processing information that's actually likely enough to be correct or close to correct, that processing it makes you smarter rather than dumber. So anyway, that's we can maybe leave this there unless there's something you want to add to it.
No, that's good.
All right. I hope people figure this out, though, because it would be great. There are some... I guess one other thing I would add. There are people that we talk to when we're not talking to each other that contribute.
Yeah, it does happen.
Oh, that's not what I'm saying. Yeah. When we do not happen to be in conversation with each other at that moment, there are other people that we interact with.
Also true.
I'm not making this better.
You're not saying anything. Okay. You're not saying anything wrong. It's just funny. Go on.
All right.
I'll try to be quiet.
There are people that one comes to trust based on the fact that they seem to be doing something parallel to what you and I are describing that we do here, right? Figuring out who to pay attention to when somebody says, actually, this is a really interesting result, giving it an extra boost because that person tends to have a really good nose for results that turn out to be right and important, right? That's a very useful thing. So I should probably point to a few of these people. Chris Martenson, right, has been just so spot on so many times. It's incredible. If you don't follow Chris, you should follow him.
So we'll link his YouTube channel in the show notes.
Yep. I would say I have more recently become aware of Brett Swanson, whose Substack we have talked about, but he does some very good explorations of claims where people make a claim that something is seen in the data, and he'll say, well, is it? So, for example, his Substack on the question of were 3 million people saved by the vaccine, the COVID vaccine campaign, was a slam dunk. Jumi Kim does deep dives on biological topics where she's very careful to process them in a way that you can just see what the evidence actually for and against particular claims is. It's very
uninflected with ideology or emotion. It's just, here's what a highly competent person sees when they use their tools to explore a question. Alex Marinos has been excellent. He's not a biologist by training. He does have an advanced degree, I guess, in computer science. But
there's many more. But I think listing
right.
everyone
is a mistake.
Trying to be exhaustive is going to be unfair to the people we forget.
That's certainly true. I'll just finish by saying that Alex has approached questions that impact us like, well, does ivermectin work? Right? And he has explored those, and he's delved deep into these large-scale randomized controlled trials that are claimed to prove that it doesn't, and it's amazing what's in there. You find fraud, and you find that actually, in spite of the fraud, the pattern that it does work is present, and it's obscured by the way they wrote it up. So it's an amazing thing. But figuring out who to listen to, who tends to have a good hit rate, is key, and I guess all of those people show their work, which is what we do.